Right, hi everybody, welcome back again. We're moving swiftly on with topic 7, and I think we've reached topic 7.3 today. Topic 7.3 is called Climate Change, Mitigation and Adaptation. Now what I'd like to do is split this section into 3 parts. This first one where we'll look at mitigation, a second one where we'll look at adaptation, and a third one where we'll look at international cooperation. Which enables the two things. For a change, I'm going to start with the definitions because I think it's important that we separate out what is mitigation and what is adaptation. So I've got 2 dictionary definitions here, one for mitigation, one for adaptation. Mitigation is an action which reduces the severity or seriousness of an unpleasant situation, whereas adaptation is the action of changing something to suit a new situation. So in other words, mitigation is where we try to prevent things which lead to climate change, specifically the reduction in greenhouse gases, although perhaps even their removal from the atmosphere, whereas adaptation is accepting that climate change is happening or has happened and changing our behaviour to deal with that new situation with increased sea levels, with changing temperatures, with changing rainfall, etc. And in terms of living in MEDCs, that could ultimately mean accepting a change in your lifestyle. But as I said, today we'll deal with mitigation rather than adaptation. Mitigation you might see as we've seen before, as pollution control management. And that's the reason why I've put above my head the 3 steps of pollution control. So we can mitigate climate change by reducing greenhouse gases and therefore their effect, regulating greenhouse gas emissions, or ultimately removing them from the atmosphere. So that's the keywords I've put on there today. Let's look at the syllabus. For once, I don't think I'll read that out for 2 reasons. One, it's an awful lot of text, and 2, I think it's really unorganised or disorganised, sorry, and I think it's just like a word salad. I think the IB here is just throwing loads of ideas at you to remember, and they've not given it any structure. So if you're going to answer a question about mitigation of climate change in an exam, I would suggest you stick to my keywords above my head and think back to pollution control strategies rather than trying to remember all of these different ideas. You might want to pause the video and just look at what the IB says, but I will cover all these things, but I think I'll do it in a more structured way. So basically the syllabus is saying we need to reduce greenhouse gases in general, and then it says we need to reduce carbon dioxide in particular, being the major greenhouse gas. But all this does is just throw ideas into the mix and ask you to try to remember them. In terms of applications and skills, the IB says that we need to be able to discuss mitigation and adaptation strategies. Okay, so let's move swiftly on. So mitigation in general, we can look at greenhouse gases in general and say that we can tackle climate change by reducing our ecological footprint, by reducing our energy consumption, either as countries, as a planet, or as individuals. We can reduce nitrogen oxides, either through burning fossil fuels less or by using less fertiliser or regulating the use of fertiliser. And we can also regulate the amount of methane that's put into the atmosphere by regulating cattle ranching or cattle agriculture. Just this week I read an interesting article that might get some traction, and it was some scientists in Australia, I believe, that were looking at changing the diet or changing foodstuffs that are given to cows, and through doing so reducing the amount of methane that cows fart out. Interestingly, I thought it was an old wives' tale, but they're basing the food on seaweed, which was, I didn't think it could really affect the amount that you fart, but apparently in terms of cows it can. We could look at using alternatives to fossil fuels in order to reduce fossil fuel burning and therefore carbon dioxide production. One alternative is to look at biomass. When we burn biomass or biofuels, we do put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but biofuels are carbon neutral because all of the carbon dioxide that you release was originally taken out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis when those plants were alive. We looked at that in topic 7.2. And then obviously we could look at programs of reducing deforestation and encouraging afforestation. There's a big drive at the moment, especially in China, to plant more and more trees during this generation to try to help future generations. And then finally, something that's really interesting that's mentioned in the syllabus, if you wanted to look through it, is geoengineering. Geoengineering we'll look at in the next slide. It's the technocentric approach using technology basically to try to remove or sequester greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So let's look at that now, geoengineering. It's a large-scale intervention using technology into Earth's natural systems to try to counteract climate change. And here are some examples. None of these have really been used or tested on a big scale, maybe on a pilot scale. And in some cases, there's a lot of discussion about whether actually implementing some of these solutions might lead to other problems. So suggestions include things like putting satellites into orbit with mirrors to reflect some energy from the sun. That's a very drastic response. These things already exist. Artificial trees. These are basically plastic trees that contain chemicals that can absorb carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. An interesting idea, but remember that trees can do that naturally. So maybe the technocentric approach isn't necessarily the easiest approach. Other examples that have been piloted and might maybe used in the future. Putting fertilizer into the ocean to try to cause phytoplankton blooms. Other suggestions on a similar vein are pumping nutrients up from the ocean floor close to continental shelves to put nutrients back into surface waters to allow phytoplankton to grow and therefore through photosynthesis take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then other things such as digging down into rock to expose minerals such as calcium oxide that would take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, would actually absorb carbon dioxide. These are all kind of drastic solutions, technocentric solutions, but things we might have to turn to in the future. Okay, and then I said, well, above my head, I said we could have two other approaches towards this problem. We could have action through governments or action as individuals. So these are possible actions by government. In other words, regulation. So governments could introduce policies to control greenhouse gas release or the amount of fossil fuels that can be burned. Governments can have programs to reduce deforestation, and increase afforestation or tree planting. Governments and individual companies obviously can encourage the development of renewable energy resources, which we've looked at separately in 7.2. Governments can control the use of car, improve public transport. There are a few cities in Europe where public transport in a few cities is completely free of charge. We should be trying to encourage people not to depend on cars. We'll look at this more in when we look at intergovernmental action, when governments work together, but we could look at national limits on carbon emissions and carbon credits, where you pay for tree planting programs to offset or absorb the carbon dioxide that you produce through your industry or through your transport. And then finally, we've already mentioned, we can look at methods to take carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere, either biologically or through artificial means or chemical means. Okay, so that's government policy. And then finally, some obvious examples of what we can do as individuals to try to reduce our footprint. I'm sure you can think of other examples, but these are the ones that I came up with. Number one, grow your own food. Buy less from the supermarket, and if you do buy from the supermarket or other places, try to make sure that your food is grown locally and not on the other side of the world. Try to increase energy efficiency inside your house through using things like energy efficient appliances and light bulbs, reducing the amount of fossil fuels that you use to heat your house by doing simple things like improving insulation or the glazing in your house. Obvious things like using as little electricity as possible and unplugging and switching things off when you're not using them. Relying less on air conditioning and refrigeration. Using less water in your house is an obvious way to reduce your own personal ecological footprint. Using less fossil fuels in your cars by biking, walking, using public transport. Switching to biofuels. And then finally, and possibly most importantly, trying to become vegetarian, eating less red meat certainly, and trying to reduce your own personal footprint. Finally, I've said one method of improving or mitigating climate change is to get involved in education and getting involved in activism, environmental activism in some way. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. Like I said, I don't like the way that the IB has set out the syllabus for this part. It's just a lot of ideas with very little connection. So my suggestion is if you're answering an essay question on this, you go back to the pollution management strategy of reduction, regulation, and removal. Okay, I hope that was helpful, and we'll talk a bit more about this in the classroom this week. All right, take care, everybody, and goodbye.